Yeah, I was actually just opening the chat because I was just hoping everybody could just let me know, your name, your campus, and what you teach in the chat. I'd just like to get a sense of who's here. So I'll open up the chat window. It may cover what's on the screen right now, but that's okay because you've all seen it. It's nothing too important right now. Okay. Great. And actually, so I guess I'll go. I could just tell you this, so I don't have to type it in. I work for the SUNY Center for Professional Development. I'm the academic programs manager, but I also teach for Brockport online. My background is, and my degree is in political science, but the last, 9 or 10 years, I've been teaching for the liberal studies program at Brockport. So I teach the Introduction to Liberal Studies course for the undergraduate Bachelor's of Liberal Studies. And then I teach a course called Democratic Philosophies of Education, which is a graduate course in the Master's of Arts in Liberal Studies program for Brockport. And I've taught that course for almost 10 years. So before I get started, this is great. I'm just checking out what you are all teaching, and good to see it. All right, I know some of you don't teach, some of you support faculty, so that's cool as well. Great, psychology, some geology, oceanography, astronomy, psychology. Okay, great. Looks like we have a nice mix of folks here today. So I got offered to do this presentation. It's actually the first time I've done this one, but I feel like I've talked about syllabi all the time and all the presentations I do. And when I was the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Brockport, the syllabus was such an important document when working with faculty. And so, Jamie and I were talking about what to do for this, the Otter Institute. And I said, hey, this would be, I think, a really good topic to dive into. So hopefully you think so as well. And you're here, so obviously you do. So I'm going to ask you to do a poll first. I actually have the poll in Zoom, but I have a slide. Oh, thanks, Jamie started it. Okay. So actually I have a slide too, Jamie. So I wanted to, there we go. So if everyone sees the poll there, Jamie, I don't see it now for some reason.
I can see people are responding, Chris.
Okay, I'll just let you, I don't need to see it. I'm not going to answer it, obviously. So which of the following best summarizes how you feel about your syllabi? You love them. It's something you look forward to doing before every semester. It's just one of those things I need to get done, or it's a necessary evil. Students don't read. If I didn't have to do it, I wouldn't do it. Or it could be D, all the above. You feel that way sometimes, each of those ways, sometimes, depending on the course, depending on the semester. Just want to give everybody like 1 more minute. I don't know, Jamie, how many people have answered?
We have 38 out of 62 so far, and I haven't seen the number move for about 10 seconds.
All right. Well, everyone probably took a little break anyway after back-to-back sessions. So you can go ahead and end it and share the results. All right, good. So most of you, all of above, right? So I anticipated that might happen just because I think, it depends, right? Depends on the course, depends on the semester often. But, I think I do fall more in A as well. Maybe not so much like when it's on the horizon, right? And I know I have to get to that. But once I start to dig into the syllabus and dig into the language and try to think about, how I'm best going to describe my course to my students, I start to enjoy the process more. And I'm, fortunate enough that I only teach 1 course this semester. So for those of you teaching, 5+ perhaps, I'm sure, your feelings kind of change depending upon your load that semester. So, okay. Thanks for doing that. So here's the outline for the session today. We'll talk about the purpose of the syllabus. What's it for? Why do we have it? We'll take a step back and try to think about that. We all assume we need one. We all typically need one. I don't know that any campus says you don't need to have a syllabus. And then we'll talk about the essentials for all syllabi, regardless of the formats. And I have a framework for us to do that. And then finally, we'll dive into some options that you have for your syllabus. If you looked at the description for the session today, you'll see that, because this is an online teaching institute, we will talk a little bit about, what happens when you put your syllabus online and what online tools can you use to improve your syllabus. So I included this image. It was the only one I could find that was Creative Commons licensed. So it's not the best image of this popular meme, but I thought it was important to put there, not necessarily because I agree with it all the time. Sometimes, of course, I do, right? When you get that email from a student that asks, what's due next week? And you're like, all right, if you just looked at the syllabus for 1 second, you would know what's due next week, So, we all feel this way at some point, right? Like, students complain about their grades or complain about a policy or complain about something. That's clearly outlined on the syllabus, at least in our opinion, right? And so if you look, just search syllabus memes out there in the Google, you'll find a lot. And some of them are funny. And sometimes we just need to do that. We need to kind of look at what our students are doing and just kind of have a laugh and share with colleagues just to kind of release a little steam. But like I said, I'm including this meme in a way because it contrasts what I have on the next slide. And those of you that attended CIT 2 weeks ago maybe got to hear Jesse Stommel's keynote at CIT. And someone brought up his recent tweet just before CIT about syllabi. And I'll just read it out loud. Most syllabi aren't written for human readers, and many don't seem to be written by actual humans. They are written to be uploaded into learning management systems and filed away for accrediting bodies who don't read them. Why would anyone want to, quote, read the syllabus? So if you know Jesse, if you heard his talk, this tweet won't surprise you. He is kind of, his digital critical pedagogy approach does take a very contrarian view to many traditional teaching and learning practices in higher education. But I believe he has a point here. I mean, I think if you did a review of syllabi and, those of you that maybe have served on middle estates committees or other program review committees, and had the opportunity to read syllabi en masse for a program or a college or a school, know that he's not far off from the truth here. And I know, and just from personal experience as well, there are so many things these days we have to include in our syllabus, right? Some things that are essential and good to include, like, for example, the accommodations disability statement that we need to include in our syllabus. I think they could do a better job wording some of those statements, but the content of that message is super important. There are various other policies that I'm sure your campus requires that you include in your syllabus. And so the syllabus takes on this tone of a contract or a legal document, and something that, the fine print when you buy something that, typically you don't read. And so the purpose of this session today will be, to kind of think about, like, how can we go away from a syllabus that students are most likely not going to read or less likely to read, go away from a legalistic bureaucratic syllabus and more of a syllabus that is a tool for learning. Because ultimately that's what the syllabus should be doing. It should be setting the stage for student learning in your course. So I went out to the Google, and literally these were the three definitions of a syllabus that came up when I put in, I think I just put in, what is the purpose of a syllabus? And these are the very first three that came up on the Google. And so and they're not terrible, right? I think all three are pretty decent definitions, right? The first one kind of talks about student success, what students need to do to be successful in your course. The second one is about the syllabus as a tool of communication. And the last one is about, the intent of the instructor and expectations that the instructor has for students and for the course. So, essentially, if you take these three together, the purpose of the syllabus is to communicate the instructor's expectations for student performance. And again, I don't think it's a terrible definition of what the purpose of the syllabus is. But I think we could do a little bit better. And the reason why I think we could do a little bit better is because my approach to teaching and learning is very much rooted in the work of Parker Palmer, who many of you might know from his book, The Courage to Teach. And one of the things that I take from Parker Palmer that I've sort of tried to root in my own thoughts about pedagogy and teaching and learning in higher ed is that good teaching is not just technique. It's not just, hitting all the right check marks, making sure you follow all the right kind of advice for, how to communicate with students and how to construct a syllabus. But it's a little bit more about who we are as people. And so rather than me trying to paraphrase Parker Palmer, I have a very short clip that I'm going to share with you all right now. Oh, there we go.
It's why I argue, and it's right at the root of the Courage to Teach movement, that good teaching can never be reduced to technique. Good teaching comes from the identity and integrity of the teacher. That is, from the heart of the teacher, from the selfhood of the teacher, who's capable of standing in this very complex field of forces and continuously and generously offering hospitality, safety, and challenge within that hospitable context to fearful students who are trying to learn very fearsome things. That takes a courageous person. It's not a mechanic we're asking for here. It's a person who's engaged, who's involved, who's speaking from their integrity and not just from some textbook.
All right. Easiest to do it this way. Here we go. Oh, there. So, Parker Palmer reminds me of that guy that sits around the fireplace who kind of just tells you nice, comforting stories. He's got that almost like that very folksy style, which I really, appeals to me. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but his message is what I'd like us to focus on, right? And I think, it does. At first glance, look a little bit, a little hokey maybe, but I do think his message in that book, The Courage to Teach, is that you teach who you are. And so when the students get your syllabus, that's who you are to them. You become, you are essentially what they see in that document. This is especially true in an online course, right? When, even if you do a welcome video, students may not click that first, even though it says clearly start here, watch this first. They may go right to the syllabus. In the first day of class, even in a face-to-face class, you hand out the syllabus. It's usually the first thing you do. And so what they see on that page really tells them who you are and what kind of experience they're going to have in this course based on who you are, whether or not they can trust you. Whether or not you're going to give them an experience that they're looking for, okay? Or so I think his overall message we can craft for what the syllabus should look like, right? This idea of hospitality. So students should feel the syllabus should convey a sense of welcoming to your course. It should, and essentially it's like your disciplinary home. Students are not typically well-versed. And even, sometimes in courses for majors or capstone courses, they have a little bit of experience in your discipline. But for the most part, it's like entering someone's home for the first time. And so if someone's entering your home for the first time, you should be hospitable to them. You should make them feel welcome. Second thing that they want to know is that they feel safe in their course. And, again, what that means in a college course is a little bit different than, in your home. But, and I think for students, that means is that the expectations must be clear. And here's where, some of the advice you saw in the earlier clips about what the purpose of the syllabus applies, right? That students want to know the expectations are clear. I safely know that I know I'll be safe in this course. I know that things aren't just going to come out of nowhere. I know I'll know what to expect. I'll know where the maybe challenges are, and I'll know, the difficult times of the semester that I need to focus on. So, there's a sense of safety that is conveyed in the syllabus. And finally, the idea of challenge. I think one of the, things I hear a lot from faculty is, I just think students just want courses to be easy, right? And I'll get great student evaluations if I just, make my courses less rigorous. I don't want to get into a debate about whether or not that's true or not with regard to student evaluations, but I do know from reading some research that really what students want, they want to be challenged at an appropriate level, right? Most students want to come into your course and they want to learn something. They want your course to be worth their while. And that's going to, obviously what that means is going to be very different for different students, but your course should convey a sense of challenge. Or you can make it like, it should be like a journey, an invitation to a journey that you're going to go on together. And journeys, if they're not challenging, are basically just boring. So this is overall will be the kind of rubric we'll use to talk about, the essentials of syllabi and the different formats of syllabi that we go through towards the presentation. First, I'll just stop. And I know this brings a big box of mine. Oh yeah, anybody? All right, so any questions? No, I don't see anything in the chat. So I'm just gonna move on then. All right. So next, all right, so here are the essentials for us syllabi. And so given this framework about hospitality, safety, and challenge, I have a few slides here that kind of talk about exactly, essentials for all syllabi, regardless of the format, right? So we'll go into specific formats later in the presentation, what your actual syllabus and your syllabi should look like. But regardless of the format, here are the things that I think if you're going to have a syllabus that's welcoming, that provides safety and is challenging, these are the things that it has to have. And the first one I'm going to talk about is that your syllabus should be equitable for all students, right? So students coming in should recognize that your syllabus reflects who they are, their experience, that it's not biased, it's not doesn't sort of marginalize certain populations of students. And there's a tool out there that I learned about recently, that the USC Center for Urban Education Equityminded Syllabus Review tool that so you have the link there. And what this is a sort of, it's a self-paced tool that basically brings you through a process where you critically reflect on your syllabus, both the content and the format. So it's an inquiry model. So you basically brought through a number of prompts, this particular tool is focused on sort of racial equity, especially, right? So inquiry into teaching approaches and practices that affect African American, Latinx, Native American, Pacific Islander, and other racially, ethnically minoritized students. So it brings you through a process of self-assessing, how your course uses teaching approaches and practices through the lens, through those frameworks, and making sure that your syllabus is equitable for those populations of people and students in your class. And then finally, it allows you to consider changes that will hopefully result in more equitable teaching approaches and practices through the syllabus. So I'm not going to go into detail about this. I will say that when you go into this website initially, it does ask for your name and your email. They kind of want to know who's using the tool, but there's no cost to it. And, I think they have some kind of statement that they're not sort of using it. Your information is kept confidential. They're not sharing your information with anybody else. So the other thing about all syllabi is that they should be inclusive, right? And this kind of goes hand in hand with equitable. But inclusivity focuses a little bit more on the design of your syllabus. And this tool I found, the Accessible Syllabus tool, helps instructors build a syllabus that plans for diverse student abilities and promotes an atmosphere in which students feel comfortable discussing their unique abilities. And here's the home page of the syllabus. And so you see at the top the various categories that the syllabus accessible syllabus website covers. So looking at images and text, and those very much from an accessibility standpoint. So it provides sort of information about how to make your images accessible, how to make your text accessible. But then it also gets a little bit into content. So the rhetoric piece, and I have a few screen grabs from that section shortly to talk about the types of language that you should be using in your syllabus to make it more welcoming and inclusive. And then policies. As we get to later in the presentation, I'll talk about some ways that you can formulate policies that are more student-centered or invite students into participating with you to create policies that go into your syllabus. So both these tools are great. Like I said, I don't have time to go into detail with all of them, but the links are there in the presentation. And I encourage you after the session is over to check those out and, with your syllabi in hand to, give them that kind of review that the websites help you do. So what I think these two sources have in common kind of go nicely into what, my recommendation is to all faculty and everything they do is to make sure that their course materials are learner-centered. And so this article from Faculty Focus, it's not written by Lolita Paff, but it's an interview with Lolita, and it talks about what to do to create a learner-centered syllabus. And essentially that if you follow these four things, you're going to be communicating to your students directly as to how the syllabus is and how the course is going to help them learn. So typically you'll just start off your syllabus with your course objectives, and not really talk about why those objectives exist in the first place, right? So what she's recommending is that you actually provide a rationale for everything in your course, not just the objectives, but the assignments as well. So it almost is like a dialogue that you're encouraging students to enter into as you think about writing the syllabus. The other recommendation she has here is maybe consider moments in the syllabus where you can invite shared decision making. There's an approach I'll talk about later where a professor actually co-creates her syllabus with her students. So the initial syllabus is provisional, and then she goes into a process with their students over the first few weeks to finalize elements of the syllabus. The third one, and this one I think is really important. It comes up again and again, is that your syllabus should warn students of potential pitfalls in the course, right? So, they should know, like, okay, 3 weeks in, we have our first significant assignment. You'll want to make sure that you do X, Y, and Z to complete that assignment. You'll want to make sure you touch base with me at some point to make sure you're on the right track. So students should, again, that sort of navigational aspect, and that communicates to students that you're concerned first and foremost with their success in the course, and you're going to help guide them through the course. And that kind of leads to the last recommendation she has there, how to stay on track in the course, what previous students have said about what's helped them be successful. Again, making it so that it's not a puzzle for them to figure out on their own, but rather you're their tour guide to the course, and you're going to try to hopefully make sure they don't get lost. In this final essentials document, if you just have one thing, if you're kind of I like to read article person rather than maybe go through those tutorials or those self-paced workshops that I mentioned earlier, this is for you if you're more of I like to read stuff person. Kevin Gannon, he's on Twitter as the Tattooed Prof. You may know Kevin from that, but he tweets a lot and he writes a lot of things like this in the Chronicle. And he had a really great article, I forget when this was from, maybe a year or two ago, called How to Create a Syllabus. And it's a simple title, but again, his advice is very much in line with what we've talked about already in terms of how to make a learner-centered syllabus. And first and foremost there, as we've been saying on and on again, it's not a contract, right? There may be elements of it that look like a contract, and you may need to put things in there that you might have to go back to later if a student disputes a grade and say, oh, okay, it says this here. So, but it shouldn't be framed that way, right? Again, that just is going to push students away from it. It's going to make them think, well, I'll read that later if I have to, rather than I'll read this ahead of time so that I'm successful in the course. So, again, you have to include the nuts and bolts to do that, right? But it should invite students to actively engage in the learning process. It should that tone matters, and to avoid scolding tones. Or this is actually something he said that I I realized that I do, and I had to look back at my syllabi and make sure I don't do this. Don't put something all in caps and underline it, right? We all know now from like texting and emails that that is just akin to yelling at someone. And, would you, scream something at your students in person if you were going over a policy or something in your course, right? So try to not do that. I know we think that draws attention to it, but really it just tells students that you're yelling at them. And then the brief bio piece. Now this goes back to Palmer's advice about teaching who you are, right? Students want to hear about who you are as a person, right? And I know that if you're teaching face-to-face, you typically might do that on the first day, but there's no harm in actually including that information as well in the syllabus, connecting you and who you are to the course. Stating goals clearly, how they'll be measured, of course, that's super important. And then I like the second to last bullet there because, we're so focused on coming up with airtight policies that we sometimes fail to let students know why those policies exist in the first place. Because what's the first thing that happens sometimes if a student violates a policy? They'll come back at you like, I don't understand why this is a policy. I mean, my kids do that all the time. Like, that's the rule. Well, why is that the rule? But if you can explain it up front, they may be more likely to buy into that if they understand the rationale behind the policy. Better yet, develop the policies with them. And then clearly identify and explain the reasons for the grading policy, especially like why you grade the way you do. Having a section like that before your actual grading policy is probably a good practice. All right, so I've said a lot and we're about halfway through the hour. I want to just pause here for questions.
I had asked them to indicate with a Q or a question, and there was a question from SS, which is Lolita Paff's suggestions look interesting. Does it add a lot more pages to the length of the syllabus?
So, there's a lot of discussion in the things that I read for this that talk about how long your syllabus should be. And from most of what I read, right, like shorter is better, but it's not like automatically better, right? And, one of the things I think you could do is for things that are, you have to look carefully at your syllabus and think, are there things in here that may be able to be offloaded or put in separate sections? So there's an example of what this woman calls a liquid syllabus that I'll go over later that I think does a good job of it. And online, I think, is where you really can leverage this because you can use tabs on a page, right? So you can have sort of essentials and the kind of welcoming language and the invitation to learn on the first page, and then either hyperlinks or additional tabs to, policies and the more kind of fine-grained, things that you have to let them know because your college requires it, or you just, they obviously need to know that. So yeah, I'm looking at sorry, here. I just moved it. I don't know why it does that. I'm trying to look at the chat and have my presentation up at the same time. So I just moved it to the side. All right, so yeah, so Saifa's suggestion is good to put instructions for assignments separately in the MLS, not in the syllabus to make the syllabus shorter. Yeah, exactly. Right. Okay. Yeah. So Bretton's point, right? Colleges require a single printable syllabus doc, as does the official syllabus. So I said this yesterday. So, it may be that you have an official syllabus, but then you have the syllabus, right? Or the document that is the thing that you want students to read at the outset of the course, right? So you have that, and that's the one that, they will engage with. It gives them everything they need to know, right? But the official syllabus is a separate document. Now, I don't know if that's going to get you in trouble with your chair or dean or something like that. But, if you have to have that official printable syllabus, then you have to have the official printable syllabus, right? Yeah. So how do you go about advocating for change when the, where's that? Departments that have syllabi templates or requirements don't support this. So I think you could advocate for change. I mean, I think, especially if you're a tenured faculty member, if you're somebody that occupies a position on your campus where, folks will listen to you. But if you're untenured or an adjunct and, that's going to be a tough battle to fight, right? And, frankly, you might not have time to fight that battle. So that's where like my recommendation is to, and again, within reason, right? You don't want to double your amount of work, but to have an official syllabus that the department requires and just put that there with just the basics, right? And, and be clear with your students, like, this is the official syllabus for the course that, I have to have on file with my department. But here's this other document. It's going to give you, I encourage you to read it. Here's this other document, though, that's on the website. This is the one that I recommend you look at first, because it's going to tell you how to navigate this course. It's going to tell you how to be successful in this course. It's going to tell you who I am and what I hope you get out of this course. So, to me, it's a sidestep. It's not a direct confrontation. Yeah. And Marge's point is a good one, right? I mean, so, this is the grievance document, right? But here's you want to be successful and have a good experience document. Here's that. How many students want to know that college believes the syllabus is a contract and used in grievances? Yeah. I mean, again, I think the overall advice here is to not set up your course in an adversarial way, right? And so, if you could bring that up with students and have it as a point of discussion and be like, this is kind of, then, and you can incorporate that into your course and the way students are being oriented to your course. It doesn't necessarily have to be an adversarial discussion about expectations that the college has for you as a teacher and you have for your students, and, what they can get the most out of the course. I mean, having that discussion can be a very productive discussion that you have with your students, acknowledging the power that you have as an instructor, grading them, right? And foregrounding that, I think, to me, can be a valuable way to get them on board with your class, right? It's tricky, though, because it can come back to bite you. And I'll admit that I've had instances where, students haven't gotten the grade they've expected in my class, and they come back to me and say, well, what about all this stuff you tell us about, grades are not the most important thing. It's really about, progress as, relative progress in the course and this, and so, I'll have to kind of come back to them and explain to them, I still have to give you a grade at the end of the class, et cetera. But I think having that discussion with students in a way that opens it up and, like I said, foregrounds it, kind of, to me, communicates to them that you're interested first and foremost in their learning and bringing them into the process rather than setting up opposition between you and them. Okay. So would you use a different syllabus for an online asynchronous class versus a remote synchronous in-person class? So that's good. And that sort of gets us into talking about formatting options. I mean, I think that in an online synchronous class, sometimes you still have to have the printable syllabus, and the same thing would go for an in-person class. You have to have an in-person, an actual printable syllabus. I think, in an online asynchronous class, you may have you have the LMS as the classroom, right? So, some campuses want you to put the syllabus in a template, and I'll talk about that shortly. But, you could still utilize like a PDF for something that's printable or a separate website. So again, there's an example coming up, which I'll show you, which is an actual website for the course. And in that website, there are links at the bottom to the LMS. So students go to that website first, but then navigate to the website, to the LMS through the website. I think it's a really cool approach. Yeah, Susan, totally. It's about power with. We want to exercise power with our students. We want to invite them and encourage them to utilize, have them participate in the process as much as possible, right? We don't want to set up that adversarial relationship of saying, I'm the dictator of this class, and you will do what I say, or else you will be sorry. All right. All right, great questions. I do have a little time set aside for the end to have some more discussion. So I'm just going to go ahead and start talking about some of these options. All right. And I'll close the text box so that it doesn't cloud the screen. All right. So the traditional syllabus, right? It's printable, it's campus approved, it's easy to create, right? We're all used to it. And for many of you, just doing a traditional syllabus is probably the way you're going to go. Right? You can create it in Word and save it as a PDF or not, and the students can print it out and it looks the same regardless of the format or where you offer it to them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. right? Thing with the traditional syllabus is it does tend to creep towards being very bureaucratic and legalistic. And, you know, if it's a linear, I actually had in this description of the traditional syllabus before I changed it, the traditional / linear syllabus. So the traditional syllabus really, it kind of leads you to this linear thing where you start at the top and you work to the bottom, right? And students, and what happens in any long document that starts at the top and goes to the bottom, students look at the top and their attention wanes as they get to the bottom. So, you know, that's not necessarily what you want, although, I mean, you could just put all the stuff at the bottom that you don't really care as much if they read. But to me, that kind of defeats the purpose, right, of trying to present a coherent, kind of holistic approach to your course that invites them to learn in it. So what you want to do is to encourage them to kind of engage with that traditional syllabus, is pay a lot of attention to your tone when you're writing that traditional syllabus. And the tone that you want to have is a welcoming tone, using a welcoming syllabus, using a warm tone. So I grabbed from 2 of the websites earlier some examples of what that looks like. So the first one is the Creating Equity-Minded Syllabus. They had an example here from just office hours, right? The very kind of basic thing that all syllabi have to have, right? You know, and we think, oh, that could just be boilerplate. We don't have to really mess with that. And, you know, this example shows you that, you know, just by saying, I welcome you to contact me outside of class and student hours, just indicates to students that, you know, I want to see you. I want to have those discussions with you outside of class. If you say, if you need to contact me outside of office hours, you know, it tells them, you know, if you need to, fine, but, you know, I'd rather you didn't. Okay. So just those little changes of language can create that warm tone and that welcoming approach. Now on the Inclusive Syllabus website, they had a number of good phrases that talk about how to construct a warm syllabus that's inviting and creates a climate of cooperation with students. So the sample phrases from the cold syllabus, you know, that first phrase in the upper left-hand corner, come prepared to actively participate in this course. This is the best way to engage you in learning. I mean, I might even have that on my syllabus right now, to be honest. And I'm sure if I don't now, I did at one point. But the warm syllabus language, you know, is about, you know, listen, I hope you actively participate because I found this is the best way to engage you in learning. So it's just that slight shift in emphasis, right? Where you're kind of moving from, you know, that even though it's, you know, it's like eat your vegetables because it's good for you approach to, you know, vegetables can be really good. I've found them to be, you know, very tasty, you know, or prepared the right way. And then, you know, the one below that, I mean, and that one, especially after the past year about traumatic events, you know, I mean, that to me, I hope nobody has something like that in their syllabus, but the how to actually bring that up, I think, is an important thing to do. And so that whole idea of traumatic events are unwelcome, you know, to you, I know that. And because I understand how difficult they are, if you contact me, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, again, trying to like, you know, when students see that, they're going to think, okay, yeah, maybe I will be able to, you know, you won't, you know, shoot me down and I feel that it's okay to reach out to you. There's commands to invitations. I mean, that's one that I'm sure you could probably go through your syllabus and find the musts only. I only accept late work, blah, blah, blah. You know, and again, I know that sometimes you think, well, you know, but what if, you know, if this is going to muddy the waters, right? If they have a grade conflict or something like that. But if you look at the invitations, they communicate the same exact thing, right? And they're just using slightly different language, you know. Now, I only accept versus I encourage you to does open things up a bit, right? And so, you know, you may find that students are, you know, say, well, it didn't say it was absolutely necessary that I do X, Y, or Z because you said I encourage you to do that. You didn't say I only accept that. But, you know, that's where I think, as I talk about later, coming up with policies that students completely understand and buy into is the way to sort of ensure compliance without forcing it upon students, right? To bring them into the process so that they are more likely to be compliant with what, you know, collectively is good for everybody. And then the paternalistic language versus cooperative language, these are just some verbs, right? And you know, again, it's just a shift in emphasis and trying to kind of just make sure that you're not, just beating them over the head with all this language of, of command and authority. All right, so we talked about, a number of you I know are teaching, in an LMS, teaching an online course. The LMS is a big part of the course. The LMS embedded syllabi, Blackboard is pretty terrible for this. I'm just going to be honest. I mean, I think that, when you see, and I'm going to show you our template in our courses in CPD shortly, which I just don't think it's so great. But it's a way to prevent information in chunks in a syllabus so that they're not overwhelmed with text. So that's a good thing. But the templates in most LMSs lack personalization, right? Unless you're kind of good at really, hacking your LMS and making it do things that, those of us who have to just point and click to do everything can't do. But the syllabus is super important in an online and synchronous course, because there is no common first day of class. So even if you have, like I said earlier, a welcome video, many students will go to the syllabus first in your online course. So it's important that it conveys that welcoming that we've been talking about. So here's the template we have at the CPD. Again, these are all just individual page docs. This is a screenshot, so I can't click into any of them. But if any of you have taken our courses at the CPD, our professional development courses, this should look relatively familiar because this is the format that we recommend our instructors follow. Again, where everything is, right? And you can click in and get it. And we do typically also ask that folks also provide a printable version of all this information, a traditional syllabus, if they'd like to have that as well and have it all in one spot. So, I know in Canvas, and I couldn't find a good example of what this looks like, but in Canvas, I guess it's possible to create what I would call an accordion or a way to have all information. And I know WordPress does this as well, where you could have all the headings and then have, the little plus sign so that you click that and then you could just see that information for that heading and then, click it again to collapse it. So I know that you can do that in Canvas. So Geneseo folks, you're good, but I don't know how to do it because I don't know Canvas so well. But in Blackboard, I don't think you could do that. So, all right, so let's move past the traditional. Let's get a little crazy. All right, so the liquid syllabus, and here I'm going to actually click on this link so that you could see what this looks like because you really need to see it. So. I need to reshare my screen, so hang on a second. All right. So Michelle Pacansky-Brock, and I believe I heard about this from a Chronicle article, the teaching newsletter in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And again, that's where the whole idea for this session came from. Jamie and I both saw it and thought, oh, we need to talk about this. And so this liquid syllabus approach is really cool. So, she's got her title of the course. And the very first thing as you go down, and I believe this is it's Google site that she created. So anybody can create this, right? You don't need a WordPress instance or anything like that to do this. All you need is access to Google Sites. And right away, first thing you see is a warm welcome from Michelle about the course and her commitment to you. Again, and it's this nice balance of text and video all embedded. And then the third thing you see after her commitment to you is how the course works. The basics, the very basics. And then right back into my teaching philosophy. It's like she read The Courage to Teach and saw that, you teach who you are and you want to convey that to students as clearly as possible at the outset of the semester. And then at the top, right, so the other parts of the course are just in tabs at the top. So her course essentials are here. The things that you absolutely need to know, important dates, description, the goals, the things that typically are at the top of the syllabus, right? The goals and the description, all that, she has on that second tab. And then, as I said earlier, she has down here at the bottom of all the pages, I'm not sure if it's the home page, she has the log into our course now button, I think at the bottom of all the pages. So that, nope, just on the second one. So just on the second one, after you read the course essentials, she says, okay, you've seen my homepage. Now you can go right into the course. You've kind of have, after the homepage and the course essentials, you're ready to log into the course. And so she's put the link to their Canvas page right there, and then a link to how to get help with Canvas. Say, oh man, this is the first time I've ever taken a course in Canvas. Maybe I should get Canvas help first before I log into our course. And then support that you'll need to be successful. And then finally, her grading and policies. And that's it. I mean, you know, I think this is brilliant. If everybody could do this, I don't know how long it took her. So in the presentation, there's an article where she discusses it. I realize I don't have the link to that. It was actually just a description, I think, in the teaching, the Chronicle teaching newsletter. But you know, I don't know. I kind of feel like this speaks for itself. I don't know how long it'd take. I mean, I know for some, you know, your ability to work in Google Sites might be harder than others, but I don't know. I think this is awesome. So I'm gonna stop my share, get back to the slide deck. I see there are a bunch of comments there. I'm not gonna bring up the chat now because I don't want to put black squares on the screen. All right, let's bring back the slide deck. All right, so that's the liquid syllabus. Now the other one too, and I have a video here. I think I might, all right, I'm gonna show it, but I'm gonna just be very brief with it. So this is similar. What this guy did was he has his syllabus, traditional syllabus, but he also creates a course map in Google Sheets for students. So I'm just gonna play just a few minutes of it just to see the course map itself.
Course map. So let's talk about a course map and what a course map is. This is a weekly breakdown that students can use, designed in a checklist sort of fashion, but with lots of extra materials. Basically, it is an organized document that tells students exactly what they need to do and when in order to succeed in the class. One of my main motivations for building this course map was so that students could focus on learning the material rather than learning my system. That is not one of those 4 primary learning objectives for my course. There's nothing in there that says you must learn Backey's system in order to succeed in this course. And yes, we understand that you have to understand the culture and the system of any place that you're in order to succeed. But I want my students to be able to focus on what they are learning, not my expectations, my schedule, figuring things out. And so the way I built this out was I created tabs down here on the bottom. You can see I call them a map for each of my modules. My modules are larger, incorporating multiple weeks. And if you remember back to that syllabi, I had 3 main modules and a module 0. And so you can see that here on the course map, that they are all here. And then at the beginning of each module, I have the learning objectives, the dates that correspond to the module, grade details for that module, some notes that I would like to tell students or remind them of when they see it, and then a little bit of a key for some of the color breakdowns. And you can see this across each one of these. Learning objectives get really specific, so I can tie them back. There's the dates, important project dates or exam dates, again, grading details, some notes. And so this is kind of the big structure. What I plan to do, one of the things I plan to change for this upcoming.
Yeah, so I've embedded that presentation in the slide deck, so you could check out if you want to watch more of it. I mean, essentially his approach is using, and then what he does, he still has a syllabus, right? But he complements his syllabus with, those are just Google Sheets. And so color-coded Google Sheets, it's not too hard to do that. Obviously, it's going to take some time, but I'm sure he's got templates right now. So he just reuses that template for all of your courses. And so that's really, the syllabus is something that, again, this is what I was saying earlier about having the approach where maybe you have your official syllabus, but the document that students go to on the regular is something like this. And that's the one that each week keeps them on track. All right, my final option for syllabi is what I've called an unsyllabus approach. If you search unsyllabus on Google, you're not going to find too much about it, but it's sort of in line with the idea of ungrading, as I'll talk about shortly. And it really was first nicely expressed by Mano Singham in this article called Death to the Syllabus, which is reprinted in a Tomorrow's Professor newsletter way back in 2007. And, the quote here, I think really, and if you're, again, this is now, we're getting to the approach that might be for the little bit more, a little more brave, or a little bit more, those of you who have a little bit more flexibility in what you can actually do in your courses. Maybe you have tenure, or, maybe your department is really cool about considering alternative approaches to doing things like this. But he declared war on the syllabus, right? It's this rule infested, all the things we've been talking about, punitive, controlling syllabus that is handed on the first day is what's completely wrong with education in general. And so the unsyllabus approach kind of says, okay, we're just not going to do it. We're not going to play by your rules anymore, right? We're going to completely upend what is typically how the syllabus is typically constructed. And so this unsyllabus approach can take a wide variety of formats. I've included two here. The first one I present here is this one by Amy Nelson talks about meeting students halfway. It's in the openpedagogy.org website. So it sort of uses the principles of open pedagogy to create, as I said earlier, a preliminary syllabus with some learning objectives, requirements, a framework to start out, right? Starting out with a blank sheet of paper would be really, I think, hard to do with most undergraduate students, if not all. But then, what she does is spend the first 4 weeks of class finalizing the syllabus as they start to get introduced to the course, introduced to the content, introduced to you, introduced to each other, and then gradually kind of flesh out a full syllabus that they all kind of put together and therefore all buy into. She says in this article, most of the time in this process is spent on expectations, both the students' expectations that she has for the students and the students have for each other, but also the expectations that they have of the instructor and what her role is in the course. So this is, again, doable if you have, a lot of content in your course that you have to cover and things that, have to happen those first few weeks, and you don't have that 15% of class time each class to devote to this. This is probably going to be a difficult thing for you to do. But like I said, by the time she gets past those first 4 weeks, she has a syllabus that everyone is kind of on board with. The other, I think, even more a radical approach is, and radical in all the best ways, Kristen Blinny, who's a professor actually at Oneonta. She teaches in the communication department at Oneonta, and she recently edited a book about grading justice, it's called. And it's about various social justice approaches to grading. And in her chapter where she talks about her approach called Ungrading Communications, she shows how her syllabus is not even called a syllabus. It's an interactive course map. And I put course map in quotes because it doesn't look like the course map I just showed you in that video. Essentially, it's a guide to, what the course is all about, sort of these, why she is, her interest in the subject matter, and then a general guide to how the course will be structured. And the way the course is structured is that it's completely through consensus with all the students in her class. So they completely come up with this course content and policies, obviously with her input. There are no exams or quizzes. So this approach kind of goes alongside what's known as an ungrading approach. So nothing gets a grade throughout the semester. All the assessment criteria are also co-created collaboratively with individual students after the work has been completed. So they kind of meet at the end of the semester and they figure out like what needs, how they did. And students do a lot of sort of self-evaluation and discussions with students. And then that final grade, like I said, is based on their self-assessments and her feedback on each assignment. So it's a really amazing radical approach. But she describes it much better than I am doing right now in the chapter of that book. So that's all I got. I know I only have 6 minutes left. I have a few discussion questions. I'm just gonna check out the chat here. I don't know, Jamie, did anything pop up that maybe I want to address in the chat?
I think there was, questions about the technology to engage with that liquid syllabus, and then some, I don't see any like questions. If you've asked something and you would like Chris to address it, please feel free to post that. As Susan just posted, I wonder if that kind of freedom scares students, kind of like the permissive style parenting that causes anxiety in the kids.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that so like I said before, I teach a class on democratic philosophies of education. And one of the things that we talk about in that class is that, you have to consider your students and the courses they're taking that lead to your course, or, your institution. Everything is very context dependent when you take this approach to teaching. And so, you can't, bring them, you need to bring them along based on where they're at. And some students just might resist very strongly that completely unstructured approach. Kristen is a master at this. So, from the description in her book that I read, I mean, it sounds, and we actually talked with her on a committee looking at social justice assessments. And we talked with Kristen a few months ago about the book, and it does require that you be constantly in dialogue with your students, right? And that you're constantly kind of scaffolding things, and you're explaining to them every step, right? And I know that, acknowledge it's not for everyone, but I threw it out there because it is the kind of where this is all headed if you start to take this approach, right? Where you're really trusting your students, right? Trusting your students to be good partners in the course of the semester. And I know that's hard for a lot of people to do, but I think it really is, in my opinion, at least, the reason why we've moved to this sort of contract-based syllabus, because we don't trust students, right? And so how do we get that trust back? Or how do we build a foundation for trust? And when you have that foundation, the possibilities are kind of endless. So I had a few questions here. Maybe I'll just throw them all out since we're almost out of time. I had 3 questions that, I didn't address. So if there are formats that you have not discussed that you'd like to share, you can throw that in the chat. Strategies to make it more likely that students read the syllabus. I considered including this in the presentation, but, to me, these are almost like tricks, and I do it myself. I have a syllabus quiz for my undergraduate class so students get, they get tokens in my class for completing the syllabus quiz and getting 100% on it. But they're kind of shortcuts and tricks. They're those techniques that, Parker Palmer taught about, which, again, we need to use sometimes. We need to pull those levers occasionally, but maybe you have good strategies, though, that are more learner-centered.
Hey, Chris, there was a question in private chat. So the question is, I'm wondering if the course map that was shown was created in an accessible format, as complex charts in Excel are hard to make accessible.
Yeah, I actually thought of that when I was looking at the video this time, right? He's got a lot of color codes and a lot of those things. Yeah, so I don't know, frankly. But, I would encourage anybody considering that to work with the person on their campus who assists faculty with creating accessible documents for advice on how to do that.
There are a couple questions here. So what is Kristen's full name again in her book?
Kristen Blinne, B-L-I-N-N-E. And the name of the book is, I think, Grading Justice. Grading Justice, I believe. Yep, Grading Justice, Teacher Activist Approaches to Assessment. It just came out this spring. And
thanks, Whitney Brown just shared that.
Thanks.
There's a question from Robin. Did I miss a mention about an infographic syllabus? This is another great way to provide.
That is another great way to do it. Yeah, I didn't include that. That's why I had that first question here. So infographic syllabi are awesome too. Again, accessibility can be an issue with infographic syllabi. I mean, you have to be really careful to make sure that you include lots of, descriptive text with images. So, but yeah, definitely is another approach you could take to your syllabus.
And Benjamin asks, what do accreditation organizations think about unsyllabized evidence of course learning actually happening?
So again, I would say that all of these approaches have to be taken with that in mind, and that, if there are things that departments need to have for, for their accreditation visits, whether it be a disciplinary accrediting body or middle states, you got to be aware of what's needed for that. However, What I will say is that a lot of these approaches take portfolio approaches, take really good best practices in all assessment approaches. And so I don't see them as an opposition. If anything, I think these approaches can complement an accreditation visit or an accreditation initiative. Because what you're really doing is you're creating authentic learning, right? You're helping facilitate authentic learning with students, not just rote memorization, which any accrediting body worth its salt will prioritize over, like I said, rote memorization type of learning, quote unquote learning. So, that said, I do think that there is often a disconnect between the types of things that happen at the course level and what happens in accreditation at the departmental and institutional level. And we need to fix that somehow. And I'm only chuckling because it just comes up all the time. I'm on the SUNY Council for Assessment, and we were just having this conversation last week about, this disconnect between what faculty are doing in classroom, sometimes good, sometimes great, not so great, but, and what happens at the assessment of, like I said, departmental learning outcomes, institutional outcomes, that sort of thing.
Great. I think that was it for the questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Time. Good job.
Great. All right, thanks everybody. And if you need to, if you'd like to get in touch with me, I'll just put my email in the chat. It's just chris.price at suny.edu. I can't type. Feel free to reach out anytime.
And for Paula, the slide deck will be available, within the next 24 hours up on the suny.edu/otter website. That is, that has already got it's got all the recordings from the first day, and then it's got some of the resources already from the first day. We'll keep updating it as we get the presentations and as the videos are done rendering. So thanks, Chris. We appreciate your presentation today. I know I am inspired to make some tweaks and